All right, everybody, this is Talon Mues with Scout Nebraska, and I'm back with a Southern Rust update. So get you ready for the 2026 growing season here. I know planning's underway. So let's look at maybe what happened back in 2025 to see how we can maybe better manage Southern Rust here in 2026. And so this here is just a map from the Crop Protection Network's Crop Lookout tool, showing where Southern Rust was all confirmed here in 2025. And so just a reminder, these counties get lit up as you send in samples. We find pictures, we find the disease, all those kinds of things. And so if you want to contribute to this, send in pictures, samples, all of that either to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic, to your local extension educator, to make sure that we are tracking this disease as well as we can. The states to the south of us don't track it maybe as well because they have it consistently, but we really want to let people know where it's at and where it's active during the growing season, especially early on. So if you are finding it really early in the season, in June, let us know. In July, let us know. That way we can get the word out. And so you can watch this map at the Crop Protection Network. We usually post these kinds of things on Twitter, to make sure that people know what's going on. And so in 2025, Southern Rust was really pretty poor, um, or really bad. And so that's mainly because we had the optimal weather conditions needed for that disease development. And so we'll walk through some of that. That way you can kind of wash. And if you're seeing those again in 2026, be prepared for Southern Rust once again. And so just a reminder, we do have optimal conditions of around 80 degrees Fahrenheit for development of Southern Rust, and humid conditions. Cooler temperatures slow it down, but it's not just going to stop it. And so when it comes to Southern Rust, we're looking for those orange tan pustules. These are predominantly going to be on the upper leaf surface. Now, these can look a lot like common rust. Common rust looks very similar. The way that we tell the difference between the two there at the diagnostic clinic is actually the spore shape and those kinds of things. And so it's really hard to tell them apart. But just remember, Southern Rust is predominantly on the upper surface. Um, it really likes those warm temperatures again and humid conditions. It really only needs a couple hours of leaf wetness. So a dew in the morning, a foggy morning is really enough to get Southern Rust started. And it reproduces very quickly. It has, again, a polycyclic life cycle where it is causing infection, producing these pustules, releasing spores, causing infection again. And that can be 10 days between infection and spore production. And so these do produce spores for up to 8 days, so it's not like it produces spores once and then that's done. That's why Southern Rust can be so aggressive and ramp up so fast. And so we do have we don't have very many hybrids that are resistant to the disease. However, in 2025, we were clearly able to see differences between hybrids. So that's something to talk to your seed dealer about. Check those seed catalogs for this season. What are you maybe at risk? What fields? What hybrids? All those things. And fungicides are effective. I know 2025 was not a great year, and a lot of people maybe lost a little bit of faith in some of these fungicide applications, but really fungicides are effective if it develops early in grain fill where we can get on it. And so back in 2025, my advisor and the corn pathology specialist for the state came out with a Mistbusters Crop Watch article for Southern Rust. There was a lot of rumors and myths and really just kind of misinformation that came out about Southern Rust. And so to tackle some of that, we'll talk a little bit about it, and you can find that on Crop Watch. Uh, and so really the main points were Southern Rust does not overwinter in Nebraska. Southern Rust needs growing corn, living corn year round to essentially overwinter. It actually doesn't overwinter at all. It just survives on surviving plant tissue. And so this will not is not a huge concern for 2026 because again, we're not expecting that and we're not expecting inoculum there at the beginning of the season to develop into Southern Rust during the growing season. Southern Rust has to blow up from the like very south part of the country and even into Mexico, where they actually have corn on corn year round, growing all the time. So it really doesn't have much to do with temperature, except for the fact that corn can't grow here in the Great Plains during the winter. It is just too cold. So Southern rust also has a very narrow host range. It does not infect other grasses. It's so specific. The other rust that you see on your grasses, on wheat, on those kinds of things, they're different pathogens. They are still rust pathogens, but they're different fungi altogether. And so, while they may look familiar, that is not contributing to the disease in your cornfields. Additionally, there are no super strains. We're not necessarily seeing an increase in virulence. It just really has to do with the environmental conditions that we had this growing season. We had super good growing conditions for southern rust on corn this year. And so I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. So the abnormal solar radiation levels are kind of one of the main first points that we see with southern rust. We had smoke, abnormal cloud cover, we were behind on GDUs for our corn, all of those kinds of things. That solar radiation, just a reminder, I mean, that solar radiation kills a lot of spores in our atmosphere. That's why southern rust appears orange. Those spores are melanized, so they have coating to it, but it doesn't save them from that UV radiation. So the more radiation we have, the more spores that die. So this past year, we probably had a larger than normal inoculum load coming up from the south through our wind patterns. We also had really optimal temperatures, and so the we were much warmer than average. However, our relative humidity was higher than normal as well, which kind of kept it from being so hot. We kept very consistent, like 80-degree temperatures, warm nights, cooler days, still warm days, obviously. And so just keep that in mind. If we have really humid conditions, that's kind of like a buffer for our temperature fluctuations. And we see really consistent temperatures when things are very humid uh, in the season. And one of the things that I do really want to bring to your attention is the wind patterns that we've seen for the last 2 years. 2024 and 2025 were some of the worst southern rest years we've seen probably in recent memory. I think of a handful maybe back in 2006 um, that were maybe equally as bad. But one of those things is probably determined by some of these wind patterns that we've seen the last 2 years. Over here on the left, we see a normal, maybe not a normal wind pattern, but a pattern on a year where southern rust wasn't very significant. And so this is the month of July. The direction, this is a wind rose. And so the direction is shown on the outside, and then there's a percent. Each one of these levels is a different level of a percent on how prevalent those winds were. And so up here we're seeing pretty prevalent north winds at high wind speeds during 2023, but really it's kind of all over the place. When we look at 2024, you can see the scale has changed here. So up to 14%, more than 14% of our winds throughout all of July were coming from the south. When you include south, southeast, you probably get upwards of more than 30%, 40%. Really, more than 50% of our winds were probably coming from the south, really driving those winds coming up from uh, the southern states where that southern rust starts its infection during the growing season. When we get to 2025, it's even worse. Again, our scale changes here. Our max out here on the edge is around 20%. We're seeing so much of those winds from the south. That's not only maybe carrying additional spores and additional inoculum load, but also contributing to our warm conditions and all of those. Maybe it's the additional moisture as well. From the south. And so if we are starting to see things like this again in 2026, the university will be making sure that you know that. We will be sharing that information, especially if we're seeing things like this in June, um, down farther south, where we know that it's moving some of those spores up to the north, up in our region. And so precipitation, obviously we got pretty good moisture there starting kind of mid-May last year. And so we were probably above average in a lot of central Nebraska for our precipitation, which was really good. Um, and so that moisture, just remember, moisture is critical for disease development for just about all of our diseases. And when it comes to fungicides, fungicides did not fail last year. They are still effective. but we have to get a good application and we have to time it correctly. Especially with southern rust, we have to make sure that we're in those fields, seeing that disease, and tracking it so we can time our applications properly. And so this here is a overview of southern rust and kind of some uh, recommendations for when or when not to spray. And so this here is the crop stage when southern rust is first detective. So if we're finding it early, you're probably going to be needing to make an application later in the season. I mean, but you're here in Nebraska, you're not likely to find southern rust at that stage. The earliest we usually find southern rust developing on leaves is maybe mid to late July is the most common time to find that. Hopefully, we're not finding it till August when we get more normal patterns. Hopefully, we won't see it start until August, maybe even later than that, where it's not even going to be a concern because our corn's already filled most of its grain. It's not going to have an impact on our canopies. And so, when we're starting to see it on tasseling, there is probably going to be a benefit of spraying. But as we get to these later growing stages, R4, R5, R6, it's going to be very unlikely that you need to make an application. And you definitely don't want to be making a second application once that starts moving in at those R3, R4s, because you're not going to have a long enough time to see the benefit from that application. So there's also some information about some chemigation of fungicides out there. I did this with the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network in 2025 up in Northeast Nebraska. We applied Approach Prima at R2 and then did a disease assessments about a week later. And you can see southern rust in Northeast Nebraska, they got hit hard this year. Those southern winds really pushed it up to northern Nebraska quick. They saw it early. They had optimal weather conditions and had severe disease up to 13, almost 14, 15%. And this is just one field. There were fields that were probably much worse, depending on hybrid and those kinds of things. So when we did make that application, we saw a significant reduction in disease, something that kept it below a pretty normal level. And that ended up seeing a 21 bushel increase in our yield. So we really benefited from a fungicide this year. It did really pay off here in 2025. And so when we look at our plant vigor there at the end of the season, there probably a month or half a month before um, harvest, we saw that that fungicide is really keeping that plant healthy to finish out grain fill. And that's really what we want. We want to make sure that our plants can get all the way through grain fill without stress. And so the last thing that I kind of want to show you here is this fungicide efficacy for control of corn foliar diseases. This is coming from the Crop Protection Network. It's a pretty simple guide. You can download this. It's in the Nebraska EC 130 guide, the guide for weed disease and insect management in Nebraska. And so really it has our different common diseases and what chemicals, products are working best to control those. So if you are concerned about not having an effective form of control, check that. It's put together by like all the universities in the Midwest. Um, and it's a really great resource for picking a fungicide that's going to do the best for your operation. So just keep in mind, southern rust does not overwinter. It does not contribute to disease if it was bad last year. That does not contribute to our disease here in 2026. But we do need to keep a watch out for this disease because the last 2 years have been pretty heavy on that southern rust inoculum. So we want to make sure that we're learning from this, making sure we're getting ahead of it, getting good control, and spraying only if we need to. Again, southern rust may not come in until August, late August this year if we have good conditions that are restricting that development and spread of southern rust. So keep that in mind. Thank you very much. This was video with Scout Nebraska. So thank you. You have a nice day.